I am Connie Rao, president of the Friendship Heights Neighbors Network, and I want to offer a welcome to all of you who are village members and all of you who are not yet, and tell you that the meeting is being recorded, and we all need to press "Got it" on our screens in order for that box to go away, like right now. So if everybody will please do that. I want to offer a special welcome to those of you who are our collaborators from other villages, especially the Little Falls Village, and those of you who are otherwise participating in collaborations. This is a collaboration, not just between us and Little Falls Village, but also with Suburban Hospital. And we hope that we can continue to do this from time to time, especially on topics of very important interest. As you probably know, many of you, but some may not, villages are nonprofits set up all over Montgomery County, the district, Northern Virginia, and some in the rest of Virginia and across the country to help all of us as seniors age in place and to deal with the health issues that come to most of us, if not all of us, including the topic for today, which is why it's so important. We offer all of us social programming to make sure that none of us are in the loneliness problem that affects so many. And then most of us offer services, including especially rides, but also other kinds of services that allow people to age in place rather than, which is what they want, rather than go to institutions. So with that, what I would like to do is at this point to introduce Kate McGrail from Suburban Hospital, who is the director of the Village Ambassadors Program, and whom I first met, pre-pandemic, long ago, as she was starting that program. She's been a huge resource, Suburban has been, for all of us, and I'd like now to turn the event over to Kate.
Thank you, Connie. It's a pleasure to be working with FHNN to be able to offer today's session with a Suburban Hospital provider. Before I introduce Dr. Neiman, I would like to share just a few housekeeping reminders. So closed captioning is available to anyone. You can enable it by hovering your mouse down over the icons, and there's one probably at the bottom of your screen that says CC Show Captions. Please remain on mute while others are speaking. Your speaker will be spotlighted, so if you prefer not to see other participants, please go to the upper right-hand corner of your screen and find the button that says View. You may select Speaker View so that you will see just the speaker on the screen. When Dr. Neiman shows her slides, you'll be able to see both. Questions will be taken at the end, and we welcome your questions in the chat box. You can also find that icon at the bottom of your screen. You may also raise your hand. The raise hand feature is under the reactions icon, which looks like a smiley face, and we will call on you at that time. Last but not least, a link to this recording will be shared to all registered participants in the coming days. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker, our featured presenter, Dr. Carrie Neiman. Dr. Neiman has both a medical degree and master's in public health, and is an associate professor in the Department of Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, and practices locally here at Suburban. She is the co-founder of Access Hears, a nonprofit committed to the delivery of affordable, accessible hearing care. As a clinician, researcher, and social entrepreneur, her commitment to social justice is inseparable from her drive to provide innovative solutions to address disparities in hearing care. Her epidemiological work documents widespread disparities in hearing healthcare. In order to move forward in order to move towards innovative, evidence-based, and sustainable solutions, Dr. Neiman works across disciplines and translates researches and approaches in gerontology, social design, behavioral intervention research, community-based participatory research, and human factors to advance hearing health equity and bring innovation to underserved communities. So with that, I will turn it right over to Dr. Neiman, who will share her screen.
Great. Thank you very much, Kate. I really appreciate it. I'll go ahead and share my screen now. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you all for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here to talk about such a timely topic and very much an evolving one. So the big picture today is to really talk about over-the-counter hearing aids. And the talk is divided into two parts. One is to think from a pretty big picture of how and why we think over-the-counter hearing aids are an important part of bringing hearing care to more people. And then the second half will be a little bit more in the nitty-gritty of over-the-counter hearing aids. So for everybody who I'm sure has read or heard something or another about over-the-counter hearing aids, please feel free to kind of think through your questions, jot them down, and hopefully there'll be some good time for questions if I don't cover it specifically during the presentation. So in terms of getting started, there's a couple just disclosures. I am an employee of Johns Hopkins, and I am supported, much of the work that I'm sharing here is supported by the National Institutes of Health. There are also two nonprofit boards that I serve on. One is Access Hears, which Kate mentioned, and the other is the Hearing Loss Association of America, which is the nonprofit that nationally represents all consumers, individuals with hearing loss, and is a resource that I'll talk about a little bit later. So those are just some things to keep in mind. So a little bit about me. I am originally, or most recently, from the Chicagoland area. I went to undergraduate at Northwestern, and I got my medical degree and my master's of public health at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I then came to the Baltimore area to do my residency in otolaryngology, head and neck surgery. I did some additional training in otology, including a short otologic fellowship in Switzerland through the Fish Fellowship. So that's a little bit about my clinical background. But I do have that master's in public health and spend a lot of my time when I'm not thinking and working in the clinical space, thinking very much from a public health perspective. And a lot of that work is based at the Cochlear Center for Hearing and Public Health, which is a center based within the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And so that center is a multidisciplinary center that focuses on age-related hearing loss and thinking through how can we approach this really big issue from a public health perspective. And so the center is a few years old now. It is led by Dr. Frank Lin, who is another otologist like myself. And if anybody has read in the New York Times or Washington Post about over-the-counter hearing aids or about the link between hearing and dementia, things like that, Dr. Lin is really one of the leaders nationally and internationally, and he is the director of our center. We also have a number of other individuals who come from a background of audiology. So Dr. Nick Reed is another leader, especially in the space of over-the-counter hearing aids. He's one of my colleagues and co-faculty members at the Cochlear Center. We also have epidemiologists, health services researchers, geriatricians, kind of a full gamut in terms of thinking about things from a public health perspective. So when I talk about kind of public health versus medicine, from public health, what I'm talking about there is thinking from a population level, what do we know about hearing loss, hearing care? How do we make sure that we get hearing care to all of the millions of individuals who have hearing loss? So it's that really big picture perspective. Versus when I'm talking from a medicine perspective, I'm talking about kind of that one-on-one care you get in that medical environment. So like I said, first I'll be talking a little bit from big picture perspective, and then we'll talk a little bit more from that one-on-one perspective. So to get started on the public health side, First, though, we'll start with some really, really basics in terms of what is even hearing loss. When I think about hearing loss, I think about it as two stages in terms of encoding a message and then decoding a message. So with hearing, right, we have sound waves that come into our ear that come specifically into our inner ear or our cochlea. And so the cochlea or the inner ear then has to take those sound waves, encode it, and then send it along to the brain, where the brain then needs to decode it. So in terms of getting one form of a message into the ear sends it then in another form to the brain, and the brain then needs to make sense of that signal. But that whole process can change. There are a couple really common things that can change our ability to kind of hear and understand, process those types of signals. Certainly, genetics can play a role in terms of hearing loss, including, a family history of hearing loss. Noise exposure, for sure, can have a big impact in terms of whether it's just a single exposure or a long history of noise exposure. But the single biggest factor that affects our hearing is aging. And that by far is the biggest driver of what we see in terms of hearing loss, and in particular, the most common form of hearing loss, which is age-related hearing loss. So when we have changes in our inner ear, we have our sound waves that are coming into our ear, and the inner ear then has to try to, again, encode that message. But because of changes that have happened in the inner ear, it does not do a good job, or as good a job as it could do, in terms of getting that signal into a clear signal that the brain then has to interpret kind of this garbled signal. And sometimes then we're not able to hear as clearly. So I know that's very, very basic in terms of the steps of hearing loss and in terms of what happens in the setting of age-related hearing loss. So why do we think that hearing loss matters as we age? Again, this is from a big picture perspective. So we know that age-related hearing loss is very common. If we look at everybody in the United States who's 70 years or older, we know that 2/3, 2 out of 3, have a clinically significant hearing loss. When we look at everybody who's 80 years or older in the entire US, greater than 80% have a clinically significant hearing loss. And what we also know in terms of, again, from that public health perspective, is that the vast majority of age-related hearing loss is a mild to moderate degree of hearing loss. And so that's a lot of what we'll be focusing on, and that's particularly what the focus is of over-the-counter hearing aids. So we know that the numbers are big. That's nothing different. That's nothing necessarily new. But something has fundamentally changed in the past 10, 15 years, thanks in part to a lot of the work that has been done based at the Cochlear Center for Hearing and Public Health and many of our collaborators, both nationally and internationally. And it's how we think about hearing loss. We are now very much thinking about hearing loss in the context of healthy aging. Age-related hearing loss has been independently associated with negative outcomes in almost every aspect of aging. There's obviously been a lot of attention around the association between hearing loss and dementia and accelerated cognitive decline. Hearing loss has been associated with things like falls, increased hospitalization, depression, social isolation, loneliness. The list goes on in terms of what hearing loss seems to have a role in. And so we can no longer think about hearing loss as just this benign part of the aging process. Yeah, it's common, but it really doesn't matter. It really doesn't mean anything. But very much so now, we have to be thinking about it of how can we make sure we're aging as well as possible. And we need to be thinking about, just like we think about our vision, just like we think about fall prevention, we're thinking about hearing alongside all of those other things. So this graphic is one that is very well known in kind of the research space around hearing loss. The Lancet Commission, and the Lancet, as many of you know, is a very well-respected journal and group, and they have certain commissions that they gather experts to think through different types of issues and problems. So they had one commission that was based on focusing on dementia and understanding all of the potential risk factors for dementia. And they wanted to look over the life course of all the different risk factors that may contribute to dementia. And in 2017, when this committee met and looked at all of the evidence, 2017 was one of the first times that there was actually enough evidence for the first time, kind of looking at the association between hearing loss and dementia, to include hearing loss as one of these potential risk factors for dementia. And so they looked at all of this literature, all from over the life course. And what they found is that hearing loss is the largest potentially modifiable risk factor for dementia. And when we say that, that's not necessarily at an individual level. This is then thinking about big picture because of how common hearing loss is and how strong the association has been between hearing loss and dementia. That's why at a population level, hearing loss may be the largest potentially modifiable risk factor. And that's in part because of a lot of the work that has come out, showing that even a mild amount of hearing loss has been associated with a 2 times increased risk of dementia. A moderate risk has been associated with a 3 times increased risk, and a severe amount of hearing loss has been associated with a 5-time increased risk of dementia. Again, this is not an individual level, but at when we look at large cohorts of individuals. And so it brings up the question of, well, can we use things like hearing aids? If we address hearing loss, can we slow cognitive decline? Can we prevent dementia? And that's really the big questions that have been in the mix for the past number of years now. There's a number of ways we think that hearing loss may be connected with dementia and memory problems. One is thinking about cognitive load in terms of you have this garbled signal that's coming into the ear, that's coming into the brain. The brain then has to spend more resources to kind of sort out that garbled signal. And it's taking processing power or resources away from other things the brain should be doing, and instead trying to get through this garbled message that's coming through. We also know that there's actual structural functional changes that happen in the brain that could be then down the line contributing to changes in memory. And we have known for a very long time within gerontology geriatrics that social isolation itself is a risk factor for changes in cognition and memory issues. And so is that the mechanism by which hearing loss may be associated with cognitive changes? So we don't know the mechanism, but these are some of the ways we think there may be some connection between hearing loss and cognition. And so could a hearing loss intervention like hearing aids decrease cognitive load? Is there actually structural functional changes that are happening? Does it help people be more engaged with the people around them and their surroundings? So when we don't know the question, I know there is a lot in the popular media on a regular basis. And if some of you have gone to an audiologist or an ENT, they may have talked about this association between hearing loss and dementia. What I will say is that we do not have the final answer to that question. Yes, we see strong associations, but a lot of the studies have not always looked at. We know people who get hearing aids are fundamentally different than people who don't get hearing aids. So there may be other things going on. To try to tease that apart, there's something called the ACHIEVE trial that has been ongoing now for a couple of years. It's 5 sites throughout the country, and it's trying to kind of very cleanly and in a scientifically rigorous fashion help answer the question, if we address somebody's hearing loss before they have any changes in their memory, can we slow cognitive decline? So it's almost actually 1,000 individuals that they have in this cohort. All of them have hearing loss. None of them have memory problems. Randomly, half got assigned to get hearing aids and half assigned just to get kind of a healthy aging kind of program, nothing to do with hearing aids, things like that. And now they're being followed for 3 to 5 years to see, do we see any difference in terms of the rate of change in terms of somebody's cognition and their memory? The results of this trial will be out later in 2023. So we're very close to kind of seeing what this trial shows. So we hope to have an answer, but just to know anything that you're seeing in the literature now or talking with your audiologist or anybody who's talking about it, we think there's a strong association, but we don't know with too much confidence of whether or not actually using hearing aids can slow cognitive chime. So I just wanted to put that in there in terms of a little bit of context. And I know many of you are interested in this topic. I'm happy to answer more questions about this, but I wanted to put that out there. So how do we manage age-related hearing loss? There's really two main components to managing age-related hearing loss. One is the broad category of sensory management. That's how can we get the signal as best as possible to the ear, to the brain. Oftentimes that's with things like hearing aids. But alongside sensory management or using amplification, we also have this component of oral rehabilitation. That's kind of the technical term of basically communication strategies, things of saying, yes, a device is really helpful, but they're not perfect. And so how do we make sure we get the most out of our device? And how do we live as well as possible with hearing loss when there isn't anything that can completely reverse hearing loss? We've got some tools in terms of technology, but there's other things that we need in terms of communication strategies to go alongside it. So that's kind of the two parts to how we manage hearing loss clinically. Like I said, we've got hearing aids, which are generally for individuals who have a mild amount of hearing loss all the way to a more moderate to severe hearing loss. For people who have a more severe to profound hearing loss, cochlear implants can be an option. Oftentimes we're talking and thinking about cochlear implants for people who've had hearing aids, but are no longer benefiting from their hearing aids. That's when we start to think about a cochlear implant. So what do we know about hearing care among older adults? Again, from a population perspective, that big picture. So we know hearing loss is common, but we also know that fairly few people actually use hearing aids. So that's a big disconnect. And so when we look at everybody in the United States who's 70 years or older, who has a clinically significant hearing loss, only around 20% of those older adults with hearing loss actually use hearing aids. That's a pretty low number. And we know there's a lot that goes into that. We know that, yes, affordability plays a role in that, but it's not necessarily the only thing, right? Age-related hearing loss is, like we said, most of the time mild to moderate. It's very slow, it's gradual. We don't always recognize it. We're not always aware of it. So there's a lot of things that go into that. But we know that only 20% of older adults who actually use hearing aids. And especially when we're thinking about this, right, in terms of hearing loss and in the context of healthy aging, when I'm thinking and talking about hearing care now, how I'm phrasing it and how I'm framing it is that hearing care really, we have to be thinking about it as this potentially essential tool for aging well. And if we're thinking about it as this important, how are we going to make sure that all of our older adults have access to the tools they need to age well? And so what about in terms of differences based on things like race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, income, things like that? We know that disparities exist in a lot of areas of healthcare in the United States and elsewhere as well. Do we see those same disparities in hearing care? And we do. When we look at nationally representative data, we can see differences in things like hearing aid use. If you look at things like hearing screening, which are generally covered by insurance, we don't see generally differences by race, ethnicity. But when we start to look at things like hearing aid use, we do see that only around 10%, for example, in this cohort of older Mexican Americans or older African Americans with hearing loss actually use hearing aids. When we look at another cohort as well, not nationally representative, we see some of the same differences, with only around 10% of African-American older adults in this group with hearing loss actually use hearing aids. And we see differences by education, by total assets, socioeconomic status. So we know differences in hearing care exist. So when we know not everybody gets hearing care, and we know that these big differences in hearing care exist, but there's millions of individuals who have hearing loss, how do we expand access to hearing care? There have been a lot of thought and a lot of exciting developments over the years in this area. In 2015, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology met, and that was the first time they looked and they said, what can we do to advance access to hearing care? And their one recommendation was, let's look at and think about over-the-counter hearing aids. That was followed the next year by the National Academies of Medicine, did a year-long committee of looking at access and affordability around hearing care. After a year-long kind of study, they came out with a number of recommendations, one of which also echoed the President's Council of saying we need to move forward with over-the-counter hearing aids. They also had recommendations of things like we need to think about more models of care beyond just the clinic, but working with individuals like community health workers, for example, to expand access to hearing care. So 2016 was that report. 1 year later, August 2017, that's like record time, we went to bipartisan federal legislation that passed to establish over-the-counter hearing aids as a category within the FDA. As we know, it took many years and many delays to go from 2017 to now October of 2022 of actually rolling out over-the-counter hearing aids. But that's 2017. That's Dr. Lin, the director of our center, who testified in front of Congress in support of over-the-counter hearing aids. In terms of the goals that I would say our group has for over-the-counter hearing aids is that we're hoping that we open up this market to decrease costs, improve quality, hopefully have more options out there responsive to the needs of all of the different types of users that are out there for hearing aids, and to hopefully also open doors for new models of care. And what do I mean by new models of care? Some are things like partnering with community health workers in order to get devices into more people's hands. And community delivered hearing care is thinking not about clinic-based care, but it's thinking about how can audiologists and ENTs work with others to extend their expertise, often like things like community health workers. So when I talk about community delivered hearing care, it's definitely not a replacement, but an addition in terms of we know not everybody wants to come to clinic or can come to clinic. So how can we fill those gaps? And so these are additional models of care. We've worked past a number of years at a program called HEARS. And what that is a 2-hour program that's designed to be delivered by a community health worker entirely within a community setting using over-the-counter hearing aids. It's at 2 hours. They go through the basics of hearing loss. They go through a basic step-by-step fitting and orientation to an over-the-counter device, and then some of those communication strategies in terms of that oral rehabilitation that I mentioned. These are just a couple of examples of kind of what the community health workers go through when they go through that 2-hour session. These are a couple of the community health workers who delivered the program. And hot off the press in terms of that was 5-year trial, just came out yesterday, were the results of that trial in JAMA. And so what we found in our 5-year trial of looking at that program was that we had 151 individuals who were part of that trial. All of them had hearing loss. It was the largest trial to date of low-income older adults to be included in a trial around hearing loss. You can see they are around 77 years old. We had 13 community sites throughout Baltimore. Those 151 individuals, half got the program and half had to wait. And so what we were looking to see is 3 months after going through this 2-hour program where you got an over-the-counter device delivered by a community health worker, do we see improvements in communication function? And so what we found are for those that were in the group who got the program, they had improvements in their communication function compared to those who had to wait. They didn't really have much change in their communication function. And so what we found, that number itself, that 13-point improvement in communication function, I know doesn't mean too much, but what that means is that 13-point improvement in communication function is in line with what we see for gold standard hearing aids fit by an audiologist. So this is over-the-counter devices fit by a community health worker entirely in a community setting. And we saw improvements that were similar to what we could see with gold standard hearing aids. So helping pave the way to say, yes, there are other models and low-cost ways that we can think about delivering hearing care. So what does that mean? So we have some initial signs that low-cost hearing technology works, obviously, for the appropriate person, and that community-delivered approaches to hearing care may be a promising way to try to help get care to more people. So I know that's a lot of the big picture, and I wanted to provide a little bit of that context of why we think over-the-counter hearing aids are so important. But now we'll get into a little bit more in terms of over-the-counter hearing aids and thinking more from that kind of one-on-one perspective, are over-the-counter hearing aids something that are right for me? I will say, I think everybody may already have some of the thoughts in terms of if it may be a good thing for you or not. I hope this will answer some of your questions. And I'm happy to take more questions, but there is definitely a lot that is changing and evolving very quickly since we're all very new to this space. So some of the things, absolutely, if you have any of these, that you need to see an ear, nose, and throat doctor generally, at least a doctor, but generally an ear, nose, and throat doctor or an ear specialist or an otologist like myself. Things like if you have any kind of drainage from your ear, if you have any kind of ongoing pain, discomfort, yeah, a little bit of pain, discomfort, and every now and then, but on an ongoing basis. Dizziness, feeling that the room is spinning. And in particular, if you have a sudden change in hearing, that is, one of the few ear emergencies and a reason to be seen. And then if there's a big difference in hearing between your ears. These are relatively rare at a population level, but if these are anything that you experience or have experienced in the past, that would be reason to kind of give pause and say, over-the-counter hearing aids are not designed for you unless you've seen a doctor and kind of cleared from a medical perspective. So those are things in terms of kind of the black box warnings on the devices of that to over-the-counter hearing aids. Just going out and getting one is not 100% until you have a little bit of an evaluation. So with that aside, in terms of over-the-counter hearing aids, they are designed for adults. So they're not designed for children. They are designed for anybody who's 18 years or older. In general, these products are designed for the most common form of hearing loss, which is age-related hearing loss, which is symmetric, meaning the hearing is about the same in both ears, that it's generally a gradual change over time, and that it's a nerve-related hearing loss. So that's generally what we're thinking about and talking about in terms of over-the-counter hearing aids. And then the other thing is that it's designed for mild to moderate hearing loss. An important caveat of the over-the-counter hearing aids is that it is perceived mild to moderate hearing loss. So in order to get hearing aids, over-the-counter hearing aids, you do not have to see an audiologist. You do not have to do any type of hearing testing. If you feel like you have some degree of hearing loss, an over-the-counter hearing device may be right for you. Some of the ways to kind of try to gauge whether or not you have a mild to moderate hearing loss, obviously beyond just, going to see an audiologist and getting a formal hearing test. Having trouble with background noise. That's one of the most common ways even a mild amount of hearing loss can start to present itself, of saying, I'm having a little bit more difficulty in a social setting, a gathering, a restaurant, things like that, a party. Having a little bit of difficulty on the phone when you don't necessarily have prompts like seeing somebody's lips or seeing their gestures to kind of fill in gaps. Finding this, you need to turn up the volume of the radio or the TV. Feeling like people are mumbling. Again, the biggest thing that I would say people can experience when they start to have some hearing changes, mild to moderate, is that they feel like people are mumbling, and that sensation of I can hear you, but I can't always understand you in terms of some of that clarity. So those are some ways that may align with a mild to moderate hearing loss beyond, actually getting your hearing tested. So there's over-the-counter hearing aids, but over-the-counter devices that may help with hearing are actually nothing new. So what we used in that trial that I mentioned were actually something called personal sound amplification products, or PSAPs. So prior to this over-the-counter hearing aid legislation, there were these over-the-counter devices. Anybody could go out and buy a personal sound amplification product. They were things like pocket talkers. I'll have a picture of that later. There are things like devices that like hunters use to kind of have normal hearing but want to give you a boost, but provide amplification that is basically identical in some cases to what you can get from hearing aids. So personal sound amplifying products have been on the market for decades now and are not something new. But the big difference about personal sound amplification products is that they were not regulated. So it was kind of the Wild West. If you went out to buy something online or just at the drugstore and they weren't technically a hearing aid, there was no accountability in terms of safety or quality. All of the devices that we used in our study have been devices that we've tested at the Cochlear Center. There's been small studies that have looked at these types of products, and some of the products out there are very high quality and are very similar in terms of their uses and their gain and amplification to hearing aids, but not all. So the big advance of over-the-counter hearing aids as a regulated device now is that it guarantees that if it is an over-the-counter hearing aid registered by the FDA and goes through their standards, we can now guarantee that those devices meet certain safety standards and meet certain quality standards. That's the big advance. So that instead of it being kind of who knows what you're getting, which is very much what it used to be, you can now have some faith in terms of the device that you're getting is going to work and that it's safe. So over-the-counter hearing aids are, like I said, quickly evolving. There are a lot of products that are advertising themselves as over-the-counter hearing aids, but have not yet maybe technically registered with the FDA. So that is something to be mindful of if you're looking at an over-the-counter device, is to see if it's been registered by the FDA. Have they gone through what they needed to demonstrate, yes, we have a quality product, yes, it meets safety standards, yes, this is good to go, safe to use. So there are a number of different resources out there. Hearingtracker.com is run by an audiologist, and they have reviews of hearing aids, things like that. But they also have a recently published, I think it just came out a couple days ago or so, what is the latest list of kind of over-the-counter hearing aids that have actually been through kind of the FDA process. You could certainly search the FDA's website, but that's one resource to look through in terms of, is this device actually registered with the FDA? So that's one thing to be mindful of. So you can purchase over-the-counter hearing aids online, Amazon, directly from the places, whatnot. You can find them in pharmacies now. You can find them in stores like Best Buy. You can find them in stores like Costco as well. Costco sells hearing aids. Costco also sells some of the over-the-counter devices now too. Many audiologists and ENT offices are also starting to sell over-the-counter devices. Know that not every audiologist and every ENT, everybody's kind of seeing how they want to incorporate over-the-counter hearing aids or not into their practices. I will say, for example, at Hopkins, the audiologists do have different pathways to purchase over-the-counter hearing aids, in collaboration with an audiologist. So that is, there's a number of routes that are out there to get an over-the-counter hearing aid. So the things that I think are important to think through as you're deciding whether or not this may be something for you. One is, I would say the starting point is, how important is it for you to know about your hearing loss? Is it important that you yourself go through and have a hearing test? Some people really like that kind of objective information to know exactly what their hearing is, and where they're at in the spectrum, and they really need that information to want to move forward. I will say for myself that you do not need, if you don't have any of the warning signs, but you're feeling like you're struggling a little bit in certain settings, you do not have to get your hearing tested in order to try an over-the-counter device. My hope and my goal is that you have access to effective communication. Whether you go through all of the medical steps that have traditionally been taken, that's fine, but I certainly don't feel strongly about that, because the vast majority of the time, there is nothing that we're missing in terms of big, scary things. Vast majority of the time, we're just talking about age-related hearing loss. I will say hearing testing is often covered by insurance, and so that for many people should not be a barrier if you're thinking about that. If it is something that'd be helpful for you, I would highly recommend go to see an audiologist and get your hearing tested to know, are you in that mild to moderate range or not? The other thing to think about is, how much do I want to navigate this on my own? I think you'll already maybe getting a little bit of a sense that it takes a lot to navigate here. And that is a lot of the reason why we're doing the work we're doing in terms of thinking through different models of hearing care to connect people to even some of these over-the-counter devices, because we think that extra help and navigation can be helpful for many people. Also thinking about, do you have access to friends or family who may be able to help you if you do run into a little bit of an issue? And because a lot of this is works based on smartphones, computers, apps, how comfortable are you with some of those technologies? Okay, so if you're saying, yep, I think maybe an over-the-counter hearing aid may be right for me, I think really knowing very specifically, does this particular one, how does it work? Do I need my smartphone? Do I need a computer? Do I need to download an app? Do I have to use that to just set it up? And then I don't need my phone or computer in order to use it or adjust it as an ongoing basis? Or do I need to always have my app available in order to adjust the volume? There's different ways of approaching it. There's also different ways in terms of a self-fit hearing aid versus presets. So a self-fit hearing aid is going to be specifically tailored to your hearing loss of giving you the boost that you need. And so self-fit is what I would recommend, but that often means that you'll have to download an app, and you'll have to make sure you can connect your device via Bluetooth to your smartphone or computer to make sure you get that fit. So there's a little bit more, steps involved with a self-fit, but that's the ideal situation. Also thinking through the trial period and the return policy and seeing that ahead of time. It is not like glasses. You will need time to get used to your hearing aids, whether they're over the counter or otherwise. It takes at least a month of regularly using your hearing aids to understand and see, is it helping or not? Anytime you put hearing aids on for the first time, things are going to sound too loud. You're going to hear things you don't want to hear. Oftentimes it's very frustrating. It takes time to get over that hump. The only way you're going to get over that hump is by using the device regularly. So you need to make sure that there's a return policy or trial period that I would say at least 30 days to see if this is something that is fits for you. Then is it rechargeable or does it require batteries? And then what type of batteries? Something that can be helpful for many people is being able to have a telecoil, which then connects to a loop system. Loop systems are often in places like theaters or large public gathering spaces where your hearing aid can connect directly to the amplification system. So some over-the-counter devices have that, some don't. Some hearing aids have that. Also, can your hearing aid connect directly to your phone to be able to listen to music or to be able to use it like, to pick up the phone, like a Bluetooth headset type of thing? Those are some other features to think about. Some of the technical considerations, many of the devices have this, but are there ways in which it manages kind of the signal to noise ratio? And oftentimes they do that by having multiple microphones to help say, I want to hear what's in front of me, but I don't want to hear what's on the side of me in terms of background noise. Does it have some type of device in terms of a remote microphone, in terms of something that you can give to somebody else to pick up their voice more clearly? And that telecoil is what I just mentioned there. Thinking through and just looking at what are the size of the buttons? Is that something I can even push and be able to feel when it's on my ear? If you push the button and there's these beeps and boops and it's hard to interpret versus, hit the button and it says volume up. That's a lot easier to understand than kind of this random series of beeps, boops, but you're trying to make your adjustments. What are the charging options? What type of training materials are available? Do they have YouTube videos? Do they have large print manuals that come with it in terms of being able to understand and navigate some of these devices? So I'm going to just list a couple devices here. By no means are these the only devices on the market. These are just some of the devices that I've worked with over the years. So in the category of personal sound amplification products, not over-the-counter hearing aids, these are some of the devices that we've tested and we've used in some of our trials and are currently available. So these are some of the Sound World Solutions devices. The Sidekick is one of the devices that we used in that trial that just came out in JAMA. That is the cost for one side only. Over-the-counter hearing aids, these are, again, just a couple that are out there. Jabra Enhance Plus, they're retailing for about $800. That's for two. The Bose Lexi is around $800. And so those you can see there's a little bit difference in terms of form factors, things like that. And then I have to always put out there in a little bit of a different category are some of the larger assistive devices. So these by far are the cheapest devices out there in terms of, and can be really helpful. They are, you can see they're very simple to use. They are often using, AA batteries or AAA batteries, something that's very easy to get. There's no small buttons. They're usually just a dial. So there's the Pocket Talker for around $155 or the Super Ear. Super Ear I like in particular, it's only $100. So for example, if you're just really price is an issue, these are an option. Or I will say for people who have some memory changes, this can be really helpful if people have had a stroke in terms of being able to navigate smaller devices. This can be really good in terms of being able to kind of easily take on and off. And they're only $100 in terms of not necessarily worrying about losing them in the laundry or putting them in your orange juice or things like that that can happen when you're caring for people with memory problems. The other thing I wanted to point out at the end, as I mentioned, the Hearing Loss Association is an independent nonprofit organization that represents individuals with hearing loss. Excuse me. And they have a really nice checklist that's available that some of the things that I mentioned are on there and some additional things are on there in terms of thinking about whether over-the-counter hearing aids are right for you. They are a very big advocate for consumers. And if you haven't been on their site or seen their resources, I would highly recommend poking around. They're always having webinars, little tip sheets, things like that, in terms of thinking about hearing loss. Hearing Tracker is that website that I mentioned, that reviews hearing aids, things like that from an independent kind of perspective, and has some resources available there. So those are some things. As again, we're at a really, really exciting time and a very quickly evolving time for hearing care in the United States and really globally. I would say I do a lot of work with the World Health Organization in terms of thinking about advancing access to hearing care. And I will say everybody around the world is very much looking at the United States now in terms of what happens with over-the-counter hearing aids. Over-the-counter hearing aids are one piece to thinking through things. And I think it's one way in which we're going to be able to think about more models and more approaches to care. There is a lot to learn and a lot to grow in these coming days, but I think we're all very excited in terms of, in the end, looking ahead to 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, can we fundamentally change how we think and talk about hearing loss? Can we say, do we have a lot more people who are using hearing aids and getting the care that they need? Because I would say for a lot of the work that I do and many of us do, this is what it's about, is making sure that everybody has access to the tools they need to age well. So with that, I hope we have a little bit of time for some questions. So I'll go ahead and stop my screen share. Wow, we've got a bunch of questions I see in the chat there. Don't know if you want me to kind of get started with the list in the chat, or take live questions.
I can help you with that if you'd like.
Great, yeah.
The first question, and a couple of people asked this, can OTC aids have any effect on tinnitus?
Yep, great question. So tinnitus or tinnitus, either pronunciation is completely fine. That generally goes hand in hand with hearing loss. And we think really the biggest driver for ringing or different sounds in the ear is that hearing loss. And so the ringing is coming from the brain, often because, there is not, the same signal coming from the ear to the brain, and the brain then is making up the sound. And so any kind of amplification, OTC hearing aid or otherwise, oftentimes when you give kind of that signal back to the ear, back to the brain, many people can notice some improvement in their ringing or their buzzing, things like that, when they're wearing the device. I will say hearing aids fit by an audiologist often have additional features like noise masking or things like that. I'm not aware yet of any over-the-counter hearing aids that have that noise masking ability, but in terms of just getting amplification, it's worth a try to see if it may benefit you. If you're needing an additional kind of extra level, that may be a reason to see an audiologist in terms of some of those fancier features.
Thank you. Have you tested Apple's headphone accommodation feature used through Apple or Beats earbuds?
So we have not tested specifically. I will say a lot of our team members are consultants with Apple and others. And I will say their kind of conversation boost, or they have like a special kind of term for it, is very good. So if you are looking to kind of test out and kind of just dip your feet in the water of amplification, the AirPod or the Pros have that amplification boost. And I will say for many of us who are kind of looking ahead to what's kind of hearables, wearables, different things, like what are hearing aids going to look like in the future, I think there's going to be a lot of blurred lines like the headphones that Apple has and others that, are in part, how you listen to music, in part how you take your calls, and also give you a boost when you need it. So I would certainly recommend if you have them to give them a try and see if you like it.
Thank you. Can I get a hearing aid for just one ear?
Yep. So from my, if I'm wearing my clinical hat, the best outcomes are generally if you let's say if you have hearing loss in both ears, the best outcomes are with 2 devices. But if it's a choice between no device and 2 devices, I would much rather you do one device, because if you're like, I can't afford 2 devices, but I can't afford 1 device, I would say 100%, move forward with 1 device. You're going to get the biggest gain from at least having some amplification. You'll get a little bit extra, gain by having 2 devices. For example, in the trial that we did, we only provided 1 device. And, so it is, if it's a matter of affordability, then 1 is better than none, for sure.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Can someone test their hearing at home
Yes.
using a smartphone app?
Yes, yes. There are a couple apps out there now. Mimi is the one that I use most frequently. That's MIMI. But I will say it is usually, I don't think it has great use on the Android platform. It's very easy to use on an iPhone, but there are a couple apps out there, and more that's definitely also evolving. So if you want to get a rough picture, I will say, as some of you know from going to an audiologist and getting your hearing tested, an audiologist is going to do some additional testing that the smartphone apps don't do. But if you want just to get a ballpark to see where you're at, I think that's a great way to start.
Thank you. Have you tested Apple's Live Listen feature?
That I would say that live listen is a little bit of what I was talking about before.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. This is a great question. How can we keep hearing aids in place when glasses and masks also go over the ears?
I know there's such like high stakes real estate, like all right there. So there are a couple options out there. One is in terms of trying to wear masks that instead of go over the ears, go up, behind. There's, so if whether they tie there, or there's actually little kind of devices that you can, instead of having the mask go behind the ear, you clip the device back so that instead of it being here, it kind of is here. So there's like little like mask extenders type of things. There's also ways in which you can put a little attachment on your hearing aid that then can kind of clip on. I mean, it's a little bit, I know for people, if they want to have discreet, but it's a little bulky. Sometimes you can have a little like something that attaches to the hearing aid that then can attach to like a clip or things like that. So that if you do take your glasses mask off and it flies off, it doesn't fly far and it's just kind of right there. So those are a couple solutions. I know they're not maybe perfect, but those are a couple things to kind of keep in mind.
Thank you. In what ways do hearing aids differ from PSAPS?
Yeah. So the biggest thing is that personal sound amplification products, PSAPs, are not regulated, and OTC hearing aids are, and OTC hearing aids they can't exceed certain limits, and in terms of how much boost or how much amplification. So I'd say the main difference is if they're regulated or not. Generally, when you're looking at a personal sound amplifying product, they can't say that they're for hearing loss. They have to dance around and are very gray because it's a gray area. They can be used as amplification products and we use them as that, but they can't market it that way. So they're a lot, it's much more in a gray area. And that's what moving forward to over-the-counter hearing aids is going to try to get rid of a lot of that gray area. And so with more confidence exactly what you're getting. So we expect that kind of go by the wayside as things are moving more solidly towards over-the-counter hearing aids. We are.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is a slightly different tinnitus question. Can you recommend anything to use at night?
Yeah. So I know that's often, when it's quiet and there's not as much going on, that's often the time when you hear it more and you're more bothered by it. Generally, some of the things that we, recommend are basic, and many of you may have already kind of seen or tried some of these things, but things like noise maskers can be a big help. So whether or not it's white noise in terms of, or, rain, or, having a fan on, again, not perfect, but those are some of the ways. Meditation, mindfulness are other things that are some proven strategies that can help in terms of managing it. I know ringing is a tough thing, and sometimes it's a matter of trying to come to terms with it and train your brain to kind of put it in the back as much as possible.
Thank you. This is a great question. You've talked about safety. What are the safety issues?
Safety issues. I think the biggest one is the amplification or the gain too much. Are you going to cause damage in terms of, a noise-induced hearing loss if there aren't set controls in terms of, let's say you only have a mild hearing loss, but for whatever reason, you were able to set the device on as if you had a severe hearing loss and you were just getting way too much amplification. So there are set limits for over-the-counter hearing aids that they're not supposed to go above a certain amount of amplification. And that goes back to, the importance of ideally having a device that is fit for you, but even the preset options, you can play around with them and see, does it fit your hearing loss? So the main safety issue is, from my perspective, is the boost too much? The other safety issue from a population perspective is if you have things like a sudden change in hearing or big difference in hearing loss, and you get a hearing aid, an over-the-counter hearing aid, but don't ever go see a doctor, that would be the safety issue from a public health perspective.
Thank you. What are the advantages of in-the-ear devices or behind the ear?
Many people like in the ear devices because they can be a little bit more discreet. I will say behind the ear devices, I'd say, are more common, and oftentimes because that kind of thing behind the ear is usually the battery. And so instead of having it all kind of in very small device in the inner ear, you have some ability to then have a bigger battery here. You have the ability to separate mics so that you may have a mic here and a mic here to help again with that directional microphone in terms of managing background noise or things like that. Those are some of the things. In the ear devices do some of those things, but it's obviously in a lot tighter space and may not have necessarily the boost you need in terms of amplification, or may not have the same kind of battery life that a behind the ear may have. Those are broadly some of the differences.
Thank you. Is it best to wait until new competitive devices become available, since OTC devices are now allowed, and also prices should come down with competition?
I will say for many of us, we are quite disappointed in how expensive these initial devices on the market are. Our hope would be to have more devices for this full spectrum of people who need hearing care in terms of price points, features, things like that. But I will also say that, I don't know how quickly or not quickly this market is going to change. And if, especially, I know we don't have to say that, a hearing aid is going to slow cognitive decline. But I will say, if I'm counseling my loved one, and if you're, saying, I think I'm ready for a hearing aid or some type of boost, I would say you should do it now. You should not wait, because we know on average it takes 7 to 9 years for people, when they initially think they have a hearing loss, to actually doing something about their hearing loss. That's a lot of time. And if we're thinking about how do we make sure you're aging as well as possible and your brain is getting as much clear information as possible, I would say doing something sooner than later would be my recommendation, because I cannot promise you a year from now or 5 years from now what the market's going to look like. And I don't want that be one reason that you're continuing to delay.
Thank you. This is a related question. The sample OTC products you showed are significantly less expensive than traditional hearing aids.
Yes.
Are there real functional differences to explain this price difference, or is it explained by marketing and lack of competition previously?
I would say it's a combination of those things. There are, at the core of these devices, are things like, can it give you the boost that you need? Is there some ability to put down, background noise in terms of making it as comfortable listening as possible? Some of the bells and whistles can come in things like, how much is the device doing it automatically? So for example, like you are sitting and reading and then you go to a party. Do you need to manually set yourself the setting versus maybe your hearing aid automatically adjusting for you? So some of those kind of fancier things can be kind of an upper level. I would say, I think if you asked another audiologist or another ENT who may not be as public health oriented as me, that, I would say a lot of it is driven by that kind of low volume, high margin model that they used to have. The other thing that goes into why hearing aids are so important is the way in which audiologists are allowed or not allowed to bill. Audiologists, when they fit hearing aids, they can't bill separately for their services. So when you buy hearing aids, you're buying all of the service basically that comes at the time of the fitting as any kind of adjustments afterwards, because audiologists can't bill separately. So one of the future things that we are working for and advocating for from a Medicare perspective is the ability for audiologists to actually bill for their time so that we can tease that apart from the cost of the device. So that is definitely one thing in terms of bundle services.
And here's another tinnitus question. Is there a connection between tinnitus and hearing loss?
Generally, the reason people have some ringing, not everybody, but for many people, the reason they have ringing is because they have some underlying degree of hearing loss. Again, not all, but generally.
Thank you. What causes nerve-related hearing loss? What can be used to slow the decline?
Yep. So causes of nerve-related hearing loss are a couple of things I mentioned very early on in the start. We think it has to do with genetics, family history, noise exposure over your lifetime, are all, and then age. So those are kind of the big categories that are often. There can be certain exceptions in terms of specific cases of things like exposure to chemotherapy or certain drugs, can certainly be a contributor to it. But in terms of common things, those are some of the common things. There really isn't anything to slow the decline of hearing loss. I would say continuing to protect your hearing, throughout your lifetime, whether it's power tools, concerts, lawnmowers, anything like that. If you're using things on an ongoing basis, protecting your hearing is the best way. But there isn't anything that I can say that is going to slow decline. Using a hearing aid is not going to slow it. Using the hearing aid is not going to quicken it either. So giving the boost, it's not like glasses where if you use too strong a prescription, your eyes, get weaker. Hearing aids, if you give the boost your hearing needs, then that's it. It's not going to change the trajectory of your future hearing changes.
Thank you. Does wearing a hearing aid inconsistently lead to dementia?
That's the $1 million question. We don't know. We see this association, but we don't have enough information to yet say there's causation. So that's why I'm very careful in terms of, we see that there seems to be a link, but we cannot yet say, 100% leads to the other.
All right. And then we have a question. I think I understand this question. After you get a device, is that a reason to go to an audiologist?
So it all depends in terms of, if you get a device and you're not necessarily happy with the device and you end up returning it, but you're still struggling, I think that 100% is a reason then to go to an audiologist to say, hey, I need a little bit more help. I need a little bit more guidance here. This wasn't working for me. There can be a number of reasons why it's not working for you. And so that would certainly be a reason. If you get a device and you're happy with it, you're doing well, I don't see then necessarily a reason to see an audiologist. But if something changes, then, feeling like you need more assistance, the device is not helping any further, that would certainly be a reason to say, hey, maybe I need the next level of care.
All right. And thank you. And those are the questions here. Well, here's another one, but you've been very generous with your time. Are you able to continue to answer questions?
Yep, of course.
Okay. Here's a new question. What is happening in the nerves that reduces hearing? Which nerves?
Yeah. When I say nerve-related hearing loss, I'm using that term very, very broadly. We know that there are changes that are happening related to age at multiple levels. There's multiple different types of cells, at a microscopic level in the inner ear, specifically in the cochlea, that we know seem to change over time and with age, with noise exposure, whatnot. So it's not necessarily, specific ear, but kind of these microscopic inner ear structures. That happens in terms of a lot on the basic science side to truly understand what is happening in age-related hearing loss. Are there ways in which drugs or medications or things like that we can slow or reverse those changes? Those are the types of things that we're thinking about at a very kind of bench side lab basis that are very, very far from human studies. So especially for everybody here in this audience, that would not be something that I'd be waiting for. But that is kind of the future work on the horizon.
Thank you. What is a cochlear implant and how does it work?
A cochlear implant, like I said, is for individuals who are no longer benefiting from a hearing aid. It can give you really an electric type of hearing. So it is a procedure that you would need to get done in an operating room. And so again, for people who are no longer benefiting from a hearing aid and they're having difficulty with communication, giving a new kind of electric type of hearing by putting an electrode into the inner ear, then have to basically relearn how to use that electric hearing. People who kind of meet the as our candidate for cochlear implants do very, very well. And that is not something that, we do for small children to older adults. Age is never a reason that we wouldn't consider. So if you feel like you're no longer benefiting from hearing aids, then that would certainly be a reason to say, maybe a cochlear implant is something that I need in terms of the next step.
Thank you. Hearing aids from the audiologist are specifically programmed for each ear. And the question is about OTC. And I guess also,
And
are there better providers that you might get help or where you purchase it?
Yeah. So some over-the-counter hearing aids are self-fit, meaning that they are going to be specifically tailored for your individual amount of hearing loss, but some may use presets. So that's one of the things to look at and see in terms of the difference. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Do you see individuals for consultation?
Yeah, I know. I think I skipped ahead in terms of the slides. I didn't show that slide. I see patients at the suburban office for the ENT team at Hopkins, which is on Rockledge. I also see patients at the East Baltimore campus. So I am always happy to see anyone and everyone. So.
Thank you. I only have tinnitus when I listen to music. Why does this happen?
That's interesting. I don't have a good answer for that. There can certainly be sometimes people can have a sensitivity to certain frequencies or certain sounds, and they may have some degree of distortion or things like that can happen. There, as you can tell from this presentation, there are a lot of things in terms of the inner ear that we don't fully understand. Generally, I'd say people will listen to music or things like that to mask their ringing or things. So that may be something to talk with and a little bit more individually with a hearing care professional about.
Okay, I think that is pretty much the end of the questions. Kate, do you have any final remarks you'd like to make? I thank everybody for their attention.
Oh, Kate, you're on mute.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Dr. Neiman. Thank you, everyone in attendance, for your amazing questions. We did lose Connie. She wanted to share her her appreciation for your attention to this topic. And just as a final note, we will be sharing this recording in the next few days. Please feel free to watch it again, share it widely, and follow up with Dr. Neiman in her office.
And on behalf of Friendship Heights Neighbors Network and all the villages, I want to thank you very much for your outstanding presentation. I think we all learned a great deal.
Awesome. Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Thank you. Happy holidays, everyone.
Thank you very much.